Hey everybody, glad you're here with us today once again here at 15 Minutes at a Big Idea. We're into the back half of Philippians chapter 4. This is the first book we've done on YouTube. It's been finishing up, I believe, the fifth book that we've been doing on podcasting. So really enjoying that. And whenever we finish up, one of my favorite things to do is to sit down with a brother or sister in Christ and to get to answer some of your questions in our question and response episode. We are most blessed when we study the Word of God together in community, and we want to do that with you. So if you've got questions on this book, maybe as you've been going along, you're like, hey, I heard that, I want to hear more. Or maybe you're like, I heard that, and I'm not really sure I agree with it. Send these questions over. We want to talk through and work through these things. You can send them to our email, 15bigideapodcast@gmail.com. You can send them on Facebook. You can send them on Instagram. Also, if you are on YouTube, comment those below. Comment those questions down below, and we'll circle back to those. I'll be recording that first week of April or so, April of 2024, if you're watching this later. So send those on over, and we're looking forward to doing that. Today, we're going to be looking at Philippians chapter 4, verses 14 to 17. Philippians 4, verses 14 to 17. Nevertheless, you have done well to share with me in my difficulty. You yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once for my needs. Not that I seek the gift itself, but I seek the profit which increases to your account. This week, we're continuing this study on Paul's word of thanks to the Philippians. His word of thanks to the Philippians, where he goes through and he outlines the gift that they've given him through the hand of Epaphroditus. As we've come here, we finished the famous statement last week of Paul's declaration that he can do all things through Christ who strengthens him. His gratitude for this gift is hinted at back in chapter 1, but as he concludes the letter, he gives this expansive word of thanks, which helps us to further understand the purpose, function, and the blessing of sharing with others, why this is a good thing for us to do and be a part of. In the last 2 weeks, Paul has shared his joy at their concern for him and for their passion to act on his behalf. However, Paul wants to set the record straight, that it wasn't like he was in despair and the money came, which made him happy. He was joyful the whole time because Christ is sufficient. He was joyful the whole time because Christ is sufficient. He's learned in all things to be full and to suffer need. We've emphasized that for many of us, we think abundance is easy, but Paul has learned the secret of being full and the secret of suffering need. Our experience of America as a whole should really tell us that abundance is not easy. Instead of finding his provision and supply in material things, Paul sees his sufficiency as coming from Christ alone. It's through him that he has strength to overcome obstacles and to remain committed in comfort. Overcome obstacles and be committed in comfort. Today, Paul will answer the question that we set out last week, and we've hinted at a few times, which is, if he's not joyful because they supplied a lack in him, what is the source of the joy? And today's big idea is sharing is fellowship. Sharing is fellowship. To understand that, we'll look at number 1, share in difficulty. Number 2, sharing is a practice. And number 3, sharing brings profit. So share in difficulty, sharing is a practice, and sharing brings profit. Difficulty, practice, and profit will be the words we want to look at today. The first idea comes from verse number 14, and it begins with the word nevertheless. And this is a conjunction, which means in spite of this. And what's the in spite of? Well, that goes back to verse number 13 that we just looked at last week, where Paul says he can do all things through Christ who gives him strength. We might read this as Paul can do all things through Christ, but the Philippians still came in clutch. He was still blessed by what they did. Even though his sufficiency is in Christ, it doesn't mean that he's disconnected from affairs in the world and their importance. He still sees that, and he still thrives on that. In particular, he says they shared with him in his difficulty. Other translations say in his trouble or in his distress. Now, we might read this naturally and think it's saying they shared with him at the time he was in prison, that this in difficulty or this in distress talks about the when the giving happened. However, if we look at the word for sharing, it goes a little bit deeper. It's more than just indicating when it happened and that they did share. The word sharing means to be a co-participant. It's more than just you distributed some funds whenever I really needed them. Rather, it means you shared in that difficulty itself. They shared in the difficulty itself. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean that they shared in the difficulty itself? It means that they entered into it alongside Paul. You're helping ease the burden of his imprisonment is what they did. They entered that struggle alongside him. It wasn't that they just gave when he had difficulty. It was they gave alongside him into this. And this is where we need to be as people who long to share with other people. We need to want to share with them. We need to want to enter into difficulty. There's this tendency in American philanthropism in general, as we hear about distressful situations, and we want to throw money at the problem to ease our consciences, that means helping them. And just throwing money at a problem is not helping. In fact, in this case, really the money is incidental to the need. The money is incidental to the need. Money sometimes can really, in fact, hurt things. What happened and what was important, where Paul felt encouraged, wasn't in the money, it's what the money represented, is that they wanted to share and become a means of supporting and entering into this with him. As Christians, we need to find a way to enter into people's difficulty. We need to understand their pain, and we need to discern methods to help them in their struggles. If that's giving, then we find a way to give, because that's what they need. If it's teaching, we find a way to teach. If it's a shoulder to cry on, we find a way to do that. Biblical help means entering the trouble and then finding a way to aid them. And then we turn to Paul's description of their practice of giving, as we called about sharing as a practice. He reminds them of their early days in the faith, and that goes back to Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas, they preached in Philippi, and eventually they get run out of town. And from there they proceed to Thessalonica, to Berea, to Athens, and eventually Corinth, where Paul, then he kind of settles down and spends a good bit of time in Corinth. Presumably, Paul is saying that for some amount of missional work, the only church that was financially supporting him was Philippi. He even says this started in Thessalonica. So this was something that has been frequent and something which has started very early. Philippi and Thessalonica, they're kind of the first towns down the road from each other. And this shows they had an intensity to start helping Paul early on in his mission since they met him. They didn't waste any time getting in and sharing with what he was doing. It's a quick thing. And while it's quick because it's the next town that we kind of read about him going to, it's still 100 miles. So while we have this intensity, there's also an effort. It wasn't just like walking down the street and writing a check or doing a money wire and sending a letter or something like that. They were committed to making it happen. It took work. The reason they were so committed to contributing to Paul when he was in prison and much further away is because they had a habit of giving. They had a habit of giving. You do this once and again. And giving and generosity are not things that we can just turn on and off. It's something that we have to build and develop. Sharing and the desire to share our habits, that's something that has to be developed. We don't become sharers overnight. Rather, it's something we commit ourselves to and we grow the muscles. It's not something you just fall into. It's a practice. It's a skill you have to develop. It's something we have to do through execution and follow through. Really, we have to develop the ability to see those needs, to have our spiritual eyes open and that spiritual perspective where we can see those needs, and then also the how to execute them. Sometimes our initial inclination is, well, let's just send some money at the problem. That's not really the best way to help. Sometimes there's other ways to do that. And gaining that perspective comes from practice and from failure. It comes from doing it right and from doing it wrong. Really, the maturity around serving and building the practice comes from getting in and doing it and learning to do better and better. Last of all, Paul gives the answer to the puzzle that we've been discussing and hinting at the last several weeks. Why is it that Paul was joyful at the Philippians sharing if Christ gave him a complete sufficiency? Let's say that again. Why is it that Paul was joyful at the Philippians sharing if Christ gives him complete sufficiency? It's because he didn't seek the gift, but he sought the profit that came from their gift. It's not the gift itself that brought him joy. It's what the gift represented that brought him joy. There are two apparent profits that we'll talk about. First is the profit that comes from the Philippians honoring God with their growth. Paul was joyful because the Philippians had shown that Christ was living in them. Paul is joyful not because this gift supplied an insufficiency. Rather, part of his joy is the fact that the Philippians are giving. He can see the fruit of the gospel in their lives. He can see the mind of Christ going on there. And he sees that sacrifice in them, and that brings him joy, that they're growing as Christians. They're not just immature, but rather, as he talks about in praise in chapter number 1, they're abounding in good works at the day of Christ, when that will eventually be brought to completion. Further, Paul is saying he receives joy at the fact that the Philippians will be fellow sharers in this gospel work. Other translations say fruit or credit. Specifically, this is to say that when Paul had success in his work, that was simultaneously the Philippian success as well. That is, if the Philippians were financial supporters of Paul, then the people who were Paul's converts, if you'll allow me that language, they were likewise the Philippians' converts as well. So one of the ways that we can be involved in the work of the Lord is in our financial giving. When we support the work of the church with our giving, we become a participant in the work that supports. We become a participant in the work that supports. So maybe we're over here in our congregation, there's work going on over here. By giving to it, we become someone who's joined in that work. As we look through not the Old Testament, but the New Testament, there are a lot of hats to wear and a lot of roles to play in the advancement of the gospel. And often it takes more than just the preacher doing the gospel work. It takes the support and the structures that allow that to happen. It takes the prayers and the dollars of the people who are supporting and being participants in that work. And we should not despise that. We should not think that just because someone is not on the front lines doing that sort of work that they're not a part of the gospel, they're not advancing it. They may very well be. Now, once again, we have to be careful that we're not just doing checkbook evangelism. That's not the goal either, but rather we have a desire to enter into that work, and we can see that growth in it. So when you and your church, when you support your church and they send out money to people doing evangelistic work, you share in the fruit of that. And that's part of the reason why Paul has joy. The Philippians have increased the gospel work that they can take credit for, and they have more joy in that, and Paul is rejoicing to see that himself. All right, so let's put all this together. We've seen the notion of sharing and giving throughout this entire section, and in a lot of ways throughout the book. And I want to focus on a word that's used a couple times throughout this text, and that's the word fellowship. Now, you might say, I don't remember seeing the word fellowship, and if you're in New American Standard, which we've been reading through, that's certainly the case. The word fellowship does not appear there. But the phrase, share with me, in verse number 14, and then shared with me in verse number 15, those are both forms of the word koinonia, which is the word we usually translate fellowship out of, or sharing with me or shared with me. It's two different verbs, basically, of that form. And something we talked about in chapter 1 is that fellowship refers to cooperation, not just camaraderie. It's not an abstract concept that exists, between people because they like each other. Rather, it's a joining together in something bigger than ourselves. In particular, we're rarely more in fellowship with people than when we share goods with each other. That's one of the places we see the word fellowship used a lot, is when people combine their monetary resources for the good of others, especially when it causes the advancement of the gospel, especially when it sees the gospel take new grounds and supports that work. That's a lot of times what fellowship is about if you do a study on this word. One of the best ways to be in fellowship with people is not to just seek to get along with them. That's an important part of Christian unity, but it's as much about that as it is about seeing the gospel take new ground. As we talked about earlier, we can't just say, hey, we're having ice cream social, so we're in fellowship. No, if we're not advancing the gospel, there's no fellowship that's going on there. Not to the fullest and most complete degree. So let's talk about this. Ask you some questions. Do you seek to share in others' difficulty? Do you genuinely try to enter in it alongside them? Or do you just look for a quick answer to their problem? Do you strive to be a genuine source of care and concern? Do you seek to empathize with people and feel their pain and distress along with them so that you can come to the best solution for their actual problem? Is generosity a practice and a habit for you? Do you look, sometimes creatively, for ways to support people who need aid? Or do you never see any needs and you just have to be asked? How often do you share with people? Is there a way you could set that as a regular goal? Maybe you will do one act of generosity, one act of sharing, whether that be a meal, whether that be money, whether that be your time, whether that be some talent you have, whatever it is there a way you can commit and make a resolution to be a giver, to be a sharer? And do you see the joy of mutual participation together and the fruit that comes from being a part of something bigger than yourself, of being a part and partaker of the gospel with other people? Could you maybe get information and reports of those that your church supports so you can take joy in the fruit of that fellowship? Can you believe and trust the power of what God is doing through that? And you can see the sharing and the joy that comes by recognizing the gifts we have and bringing those to the table for other people. Thank you so much for joining us today here on 15 Minutes in a Big Idea. Today's big idea: sharing is fellowship.